Hello, welcome from here in Vienna, Aqua Days with DSM Firmenich. And today I'm here with João Brites. I hope I pronounced that okay, João.
That was great.
And he's the Director of Growth and Innovation for How Good. Nice to meet you, João.
Nice to meet you, Ralph.
João, can you tell me a little bit about your role and your company, please?
Sure. So, How Good is a research company with the world's largest food sustainability database.
Wow.
And we focus on helping companies measure, improve, and communicate sustainability impact.
Wow. And your specific role within that group?
So, I'm part of the innovation team. And so, I'm really focused on developing solutions that make it easier, cheaper, and more precise for customers to measure sustainability impact at scale. And I'm really then focused on driving partnerships across the food system with retailers, with ingredient suppliers, with food manufacturers and food service companies,
Yeah.
so that this system can be used at large and that all of these companies can use it to share data with each other.
Okay, fantastic. That's quite a big claim, world's largest database on food production. So that must be quite something to navigate, I'd imagine.
Yeah, so we've built it over 16 years.
Yeah.
It draws from over 600 different data sources. We have data for 33,000 different food ingredients, chemicals, and materials,
Wow.
for over 200 different social and environmental metrics. And because we partner with retailers like Ahold Delhaize and Walmart and others, we've ended up evaluating more than 2 million consumer goods
Wow.
all over the world. And that's what makes it the world's largest.
Fantastic. And how much do you focus on the aquaculture sector, or do you cover the aquaculture sector to a certain extent?
Yeah, we covered the aquaculture sector to the extent that it's represented in retail stores, where we've actually seen a big uptake recently in the last couple of years, as we know, with aquaculture growing and becoming a bigger and bigger part of the food production globally.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we do cover aquaculture, both wild and farm sourced, both fish and different types of crustaceans. And we look at the sustainability impact from both the feed, the farm, the processing, the transportation, the end up manufacturing and retail and end of life.
Very good. And just to go back to a more general question, I mean, what is the impact of food production on the planet and planetary health? Is it something we should be a little bit nervous about?
Um, I think both a mix of both nervous and hopeful.
Yeah.
What we see is that the food system currently represents close to 26% of the global greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
Um, we're also seeing, from a perspective of biodiversity loss, most of the plant, animal, and fungi species that we've lost over the years, 40% was driven by food production.
Right.
And 78% of both freshwater and marine eutrophication is also driven by the food system. And I like to see it from this double perspective of, on one hand, we do have a big accountability and responsibility for the environmental challenges that we're facing. But also the beautiful thing is that we also have a huge part of the potential. And that through food production, we can not just make happy farmers and happy consumers, but actually make a happy planet.
Okay. Well, good to have a bit of positivity there, because some of those statistics are quite worrying, to say the least. And is that since a certain time that those statistics come from, or would that include the sort of extinction of the dinosaurs, for example? Presumably, wasn't nothing to do with food production there.
No, it was actually definitely much more recent,
Okay.
because because yeah, some of the scientists saying that yeah, we're currently living through kind of a sixth mass extinction. Um, and if you take, for example, another example from maybe the livestock world, 96% of all mammal biomass, for example, is currently livestock.
Okay.
Um, and so there is definitely, I think this trend and this specific study that I'm talking about, it looks at trends specifically from the 18th century onwards,
Okay.
and most of the data available is actually from the 20th century onwards.
Yeah.
But it's a pretty robust study.
Wow, fantastic. Well, fantastic source of information. Not such a good conclusion, but amazing. And are there particular elements of food production that have a more significant negative impact than others?
Yeah, and so I think the thing is, if you ask, anyone about, what sustainability is, you probably get, completely different answers. There is not, necessarily a unified definition of what sustainability is. Um, one of the examples we were talking about today and that I shared in the presentation is, it's completely different if you ask someone how much they are willing to pay for uh, a seafood product that is free of slave labor
Yeah.
versus one that is lowering carbon emissions or
Yeah.
lowering land use or that contaminates less water sources. I think what we're seeing is, like, if you look at from a planetary perspective, the planetary boundaries that we have already overshot
Mhm.
is climate change. And so that's definitely one that the food production can help solve.
Yeah.
And not just in terms of reducing emissions, but actually even a lot of the food production. And I'm a small scale agroforestry farmer.
Okay.
I can see also how actually agriculture can often sequester more carbon emissions than the one it produces. And the same thing you could say potentially about aquaculture and its ability of, through certain species of algae to sequester more carbon than the one you're producing, or to, for example, filter more nitrogen off the water than the one you're creating through your farm level operations.
Okay.
And so definitely the ones that where the food production has been more critical and more studied are the ones around greenhouse gas emissions, around biodiversity, around marine eutrophication, and also I think one that is always important to take a look at, especially in an industry like aquaculture that often relies also on smallholder fish farmers,
Yeah.
looking at labor risk issues
Okay.
and the types of livelihoods that these people are able to afford by dedicating themselves to this industry.
Okay. So those are the main metrics that we should be taking into consideration, or the ones we should prioritize.
Yeah, I like to say, like, in our system we have over 200 metrics,
Right.
and
Okay.
so it's a lot of metrics, and I think definitely you need some form of prioritization, and that's why what you're now seeing in terms of the industry at large is you're seeing a series of players and even regulatory bodies creating consolidated eco labels.
Yeah.
Like the Eco Score is one of them. And for example, the Eco Score is based on a methodology that was proposed by the European Commission and that looks at 16 different metrics that they follow to evaluate a product across its full life cycle.
Okay.
And so those are 16 metrics that the European Union recommended are kind of standard across the board. And then you can use them to create scores to communicate to consumers in a way that is simple. Because in the end, if you talk to a regular consumer about eutrophication, maybe you will not be aware of what does that even mean.
Yeah.
But if he has a score that goes from A to E, where he can see very quickly, like he does when he's buying an appliance or a washing machine, and he can actually see the eco score from A to E, then that changes things. And what How Good does is to enable the calculation of all of those metrics for a lot of products at scale through automation.
Okay. Fantastic. And how are those metrics being used by retailers, for example? Are they being widely adopted at the moment?
Yeah, so definitely. So we are seeing, especially most of our experience with retailers, both in the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. We're seeing growing adoption there. We've been working with Ahold Delhaize in the United States since 2017.
Okay.
And so we've already implemented our system of ratings in their stores and their e-commerce platforms, so that when shoppers are buying in Ahold Delhaize chains, they can see the sustainability impact alongside with price.
Yeah.
In Europe, you're also seeing the same thing. For example, Carrefour implemented at a very large scale the Eco Score, which is another form of rating that we also calculate in our system. The same thing happened with other retailers like Lidl in Belgium, Colruyt in Belgium as well. And by end of this quarter, the European Commission is proposing a mandatory front of pack sustainability label for food products.
Fantastic.
And so what we know that will happen in the next couple of years is that you will go from having lots of different labels, because sometimes for the consumer it can be a little bit confusing,
Yeah.
having all of these eco labels and all
Yeah.
of these claims at the same time. And we're going to have a single harmonized food sustainability label in the EU that a lot of the retailers, suppliers, and manufacturers will be able to use to talk about their sustainability impact in a way that any shopper can understand.
That's fantastic for the consumer's point of view. But from the retailer's point of view, from the producer's point of view, are there any costs or risks associated with making these claims and trying to calculate what can be presumably a very complicated and slightly subjective calculation?
Well, I love that question, right? Because the level of risk depends on whether your level of readiness,
Yeah.
right? So probably the retailers that already started doing this, that already started gathering data from their suppliers so they can make those assessments, the retailers that already started launching some sort of sustainability rating systems and have more experience, they'll be much better ready to face that when that actually becomes a regulatory requirement. And so, are there risks associated with it? For sure. One of the risks is that a lot of the companies and a lot of the producers of seafood might have to rely, for example, on global databases, because if they don't have data of their own production, then what will happen is that the rating systems will assume, well, you don't have data for your own. We're going to assume a global average for your seafood product.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be really important that aquaculture producers start as soon as possible gathering producer-specific data from their own farms, so they understand the type of feed, the type of practices, the types of energy mixes that they're using on their farm, the types of transportation legs that they're using, so that in the end, they can calculate an eco score that reflects their practices and not depend on a global average, that if they don't have that data, that's basically what's going to happen.
Okay. Wow. And so potentially quite slightly onerous, but presumably there might be an upside in terms of those companies that are performing well on these metrics.
Yeah, and also the environment around sustainability impact assessments has changed very rapidly in the last decade. Before, if you wanted to do a full life cycle assessment of a seafood product, you would contract or commission what's called a full life cycle assessment. A team of consultants would go to your farm. They would make a series of measurements. They would start creating a report. And in the end, you would have spent, usually more than $100,000. It would have taken more than 12 months to complete. And you would be left with a report of 150 pages that is very detailed, but also at the same time, not very dynamic. Now, what you have is currently a series of new technologies that allow producers to automate this process. And so to give you an example, in the HowGood platform, you can actually calculate a full life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of a product, incorporating primary data, usually in 90% less time for 97% less costs. And so technology is bringing a lot of potential for how you do sustainability impact evaluation. So it's not anymore, the resource, very time-intensive process that it used to be, and now you can do it at scale quite efficiently.
Okay, and just to wrap up, really, what's the sort of take-home message you would give to both producers and to retailers? I know you said they need to get prepared, but if you were to give them 3 pieces of advice as to how they should get prepared and when they should get prepared, what would that be?
Yeah. So I think the first one is start measuring your impact using primary data. That's going to be something that is really important to start with, because typically 80% of your environmental impact is going to happen at the farm level stage,
Right.
or due to the feed that you're buying. So that one is really important. The second one is really looking at communicating your impact with integrity, avoiding greenwashing. So you will want to be, as much as possible, avoid general environmental benefit claims like sustainable or eco-friendly, because usually consumers and regulators might have a different understanding of that. So you want to be very specific about the claims and make sure that you have the right evidence to back those claims.
Okay.
And I think, the other one is, and I think this really goes, back to the point of, how we ended the presentation today, which is, what do we want for the aquaculture industry, right? Aquaculture, we know that is one of the lowest environmental impact animal proteins out there, with a couple of exceptions. But that also can, make us ill, right? Because if we're already the lowest environmental impact, then what else do we have to do? And I think there is a bigger promise, a bigger potential for aquaculture to materialize, which is not so much connected about how aquaculture can do less harm, reduce emissions or reduce eutrophication, but how can we create a sustainable aquaculture industry that actually creates more good?
Okay.
And so the invitation is really, are there opportunities for aquaculture producers to develop and implement practices that actually not only reduce eutrophication, but actually improve water quality? That not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but actually are an emissions drawdown. And we know that a lot of species of algae, some species of crustaceans already do that through their natural processes. And I think if you measure your impact using producer-specific data, if you communicate your impact with integrity, and we challenge ourselves to not only doing less bad, but actually doing more good, then we're on our way to not only feed a growing population, but also make our industry a big part of the solution to some of the most intricate challenges of the 21st century.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you very much, Wai.
Thank you,
Nice
Rob.
to meet you.